starting at verse 13. And we read, "For it was by one Spirit that we were all immersed into one body, whether Jew or Gentile, slaves or free, and we were all given the Spirit to drink." Again, it says, "For it was by one Spirit that we were all immersed into one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slaves or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink." So we were baptized, we were immersed in water. We all were immersed in this water in preparation to meet the Messiah. We are in this stage of sanctification, preparing ourselves to meet our Messiah. Now, if you recall, I said that the bride would also prepare her wedding garments. She couldn't just, dress in any old kind of clothing, but she had to have wedding garments. And we find this in Scripture, in which we prepare our clothing for the Messiah. Now, let's see. Instance of this is in Exodus 19. Exodus 19. In Exodus 19, God comes down on Mount Sinai, or some people say Sinai, which is the English way of saying it. And it is then that God made the covenant. It is then that God gave his people the ketubah, the marriage covenant. Now let's look at Exodus Shemot 19, verse 14. And it says, "Moshe went down from the mountain to the people and separated the people for God, and they washed their clothing." So these the Ivrit, the Hebrew people could not just come to the mountain any kind of way. They had to have wedding garments. They had to prepare themselves. Here we see it says that Moses washed their clothing. Now, if you go up a little bit before that, we see that God commands them to prepare their clothing. Let's see if I can find that verse real quick. Okay, Shemot, Exodus, chapter 19, verse 10, it says, "So Adonai said to Moshe, go to the people today and tomorrow, separate them for me by having them wash their clothing." So here we see this idea of preparing their clothing. Now, in the spiritual sense, we understand that this clothing is not actual material. It's not, it is not physical material, physical thread, but this idea of washing our clothes is something spiritual. It's washing our heart, washing and preparing our soul for the Messiah, setting apart our soul for the Messiah, setting apart our mind, our will, and our emotion for the Messiah. Now, something that I think is important to understand is that the Hebrew people wore what is called the kitel. Now, this kitel is a wedding garment. It's a white robe, a special garment, a white robe wearing during Hebrew weddings. It was also worn during the day of Yom Kippur, which means the day of atonement, and it was also worn on Passover. Now, when we know that Yeshua came to fulfill the law and the prophets, when Yeshua first came, he fulfilled the spring feast. The spring feast being Passover, the Feast of First Fruits, and let's see, he also fulfilled what is called Shavuot, the Feast of First Weeks, or what a lot of Christians call Pentecost. The feast isn't actually called Pentecost. Pentecost means 50. So and during the Feast of Weeks, God told him to count 50 days after the Sabbath of the Passover. So this idea of 50 actually comes from the Old Testament. It wasn't something new, is my point. But back to my earlier point, is that Yeshua fulfilled the spring feast. When Yeshua comes back, he is going to fulfill the fall feast to bring a completion to the Torah, to the law and the prophets. Torah means instruction. What we know is the 5 books of Moses, the law. Now, the fall feast, we have the Feast of Trumpets, which is Yom Teruah, the day of the awakening blast. And we have Yom Kippur. And let's see. I feel like I'm missing something here. But yes, when Yeshua comes back, he will fulfill Yom Kippur and Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement. Now, the Day of Atonement has more to it than simply God making atonement for his people, but it also has to do with judging. When Yeshua the Messiah comes back, he will judge the inhabitants of the world. Also, I forgot to point out, with Passover was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in which the Israelites were commanded not to eat any leaven, and that they were to remove the leaven from their homes. We know that in Scripture, leaven is identified as sin and as hypocrisy. So Yeshua was without leaven. He was without hypocrisy. He was without sin. And Yeshua warns his disciples, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, the perishing. Okay, so back on topic. Let's look at Revelation 19. In Revelation 19, we will see this idea of, I tend to go off on rabbit trails. Revelation 19, we see this idea of the kittel, this wedding garment being worn. Kittel. Revelation 19 in verse 14, we read, the armies of heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses, him being Yeshua the Messiah, who was riding a white horse himself. So they were wearing white. They were wearing this kittel. Why? Because this is when the marriage supper of the Lamb takes place. Now, the wedding stage, in which the time in which the groom would come back for his wife, is known as Nisuin. Now, Nisuin is based, let's see, did I miss something? Okay, we need to look at Luke 21, verse 36, before we talk about Nisuin. Luke 21, verse 36. We read, stay alert, always praying that you will have the strength to escape all the things that will happen and to stand in the presence of the Son of Man. In Matthew 22, verse 11 through 12. We read, now when the king came to look at the guests, he saw there was a man who wasn't dressed for a wedding. So he asked him, friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes? The man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot and throw him outside in the dark. In that place, people will wail and grind their teeth, for many are invited, but few are chosen. So we see that this person wasn't prepared for the wedding supper of the Lamb. He didn't have his wedding garments on. Now, in the spiritual in the spiritual sense, we have to have our hearts, our minds, our souls prepared to meet the Messiah. We have to have a clean heart. We have to have a renewed mind, a circumcised heart, uh, a mind, a will, and emotion that is set apart for God's service. A mind, a will, and emotion that is surrendered to God. So we need to have our wedding garments prepared. We need to have our mind and our heart, our spirit prepared to meet the Lord when He comes. Now on to Nisuin. After the Kiddushin, after the Erusin, the betrothal period, we go to what is known as the Nisuin, which is the time in which they would marry and meet. Now, Nisuin is based on the Hebrew verb nasa. Nasa means to carry. So we see that the groom would come to carry his bride away. So when the father said, now the groom, he could not just build the room and then go to his bride. He could not decide when to go to his bride. He could not decide when the room was ready. But the bridegroom during the ancient Hebrew wedding, he had to wait until his father said the room was ready. And he had to wait until his father gave the command to go get his bride. So when the father said that the room was finished and gave the command to go get his bride, the groom would lead a procession through the streets. In this procession, these people would often go ahead of him, and they would arrive his coming by a shofar. This is very interesting when you consider what is written in the scripture. Now, when the shofar was blown to mark the arrival of the bride, it would be accompanied by shouts of "the bride comes," "the bridegroom comes." They would shout, "the bridegroom comes," whenever they would blow the shofar. We find this very same thing in Scripture. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Let's go there. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Starting at verse 16, we read, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a rousing cry, with the call from one of the ruling angels, and with God's shofar. Those who died united with the Messiah will be the first to rise. Then we who are left still alive will be caught up with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we will always be with the Lord. So, encourage each other with these words." I just want to read that one more time. Verse 16, it says, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a rousing cry, with a call from one of the ruling angels, and with God's shofar. Those who died united with the Messiah will be the first to rise. Then we who are still alive will be caught up with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we will always be with the Lord." So encourage each other with these words. So we are not just sitting here on earth without hope, as the world is without hope. We are anxiously awaiting the return of our Messiah. We know that our Messiah is coming for us. Let's see. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians 15:52. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 52. And we read, let's see, and we read, "Look,